first slide.
You want the next slide?
No, I want the first slide. This presentation is about the Avila Adobe on Olvera Street. Have you all been to the Avila Adobe? You've seen it. And you can go in it. And there's a sign in front of it that says it was built about 1818 by Don Francisco Avila. That's not true. Don Francisco Avila owned no land until 1823. He could not have built the house in 1818. The house more likely belonged to his second wife, Encarnacion Sepulveda. They married in 1822, just before he was granted Rancho Las Ciénegas. Most of you have traveled, maybe all of you have traveled through Rancho Las Ciénegas, of course La Ciénega, and La Ciénega Boulevard, one of the longest, I think the longest street, or maybe Sepulveda is the longest, but a very long street. And there's also this street that goes through it called Rampau, R-I-M-P-A-U. And if you go with GPS, it'll take you over Rampau, and the Rampau family married into the Avila Sepulveda family. And they acquired a big slice of the former rancho. Also, if you go down Venice Boulevard, there is Victoria Heights, a development from the late 19th century, early 20th century. And you can look up and you can just see that. That was on land, that was a slice of the Rancho Los Feliz that was originally inherited by something like Genario, a son from the first marriage of Francisco Avila. So there's levels of ways to look at this. One of them is that we've been presented with a fantasy past, a past that did not exist. And that's informed movies and the way that we look at the world. There have been counter histories as well, which are equally as fantastic. For instance, the film Vertigo by Alfred Hitchcock about a woman haunted by the ghost of her great-grandmother. Anyone see Vertigo? And so the fictional ancestor is Carlotta Valdez. And it purportedly takes place somehow, the fantasy goes past, at the time of the gold rush in Northern California. Well, it is completely fake history. I love the movie, but it is entirely the history. It was based on a French play that has nothing to do with California. But the idea of the haunted, beautiful Spanish woman who has lost everything because of the Americans is a counter-image. As I said, the story is preposterous. It is important to keep going through fake history for no other reason but for itself. We are living in a time when an enormous amount of fakery has come to light. And we are constantly trying to penetrate what is a lie, what is true, what is a fake photograph, what really happened, and it is very difficult to make decisions about that. Another reason to go back and find this out is what Ronald tells me is the hedgehog way of looking at history, that you look at one little piece of history and the rest you learn from that. We now have DNA, and you give a little bit of spit, and you can find out what percentage of Neanderthal that you are. So by looking at the Avila Adobe, it's like looking into a drop of water and seeing everything that's reflected around it. Mark Wanamaker is going to say a few words, so we're going to go to the next slide. And Mark, could you come over here?
I'm Mark Wanamaker. I'm with the LA City Historical Society, Hollywood Heritage, LA County Museum, and just about everywhere else. But my specialty has always been film history and how it intertwined with real history. That's what she's just talking about. So this shot of Gary Cooper here, sitting in this pre-Los Angeles building. I mean, what can I say about it? It is like fake history. In other words, film history. The script writer is writing about his film. He was doing, I think it was either the Texan, the Virginian, or one of these films about the Old West, right? So they bring him over here to the Avila Adobe, right? And they sit in there and they write stories about how he is sitting in a real West, and he's making a film about the fake West. This is what fascinates me. I love it. So the research that she's talking about is in-depth research to try to find out what the true history is. Like with DNA, it's so easy now that I can find out things. But basically, she has to go way back and figure out, that's right, the date of the building and the Avilas is wrong, right? So all I have to say is that's why I'm here. I'm here to learn as well the real history of Los Angeles, pre-Los Angeles, Rancho period, Spanish period. So thank you for letting me speak.
One of the reasons, can you hear me? One of the reasons we know so little about this time is many people were illiterate. You don't have women writing love songs or men explaining how they were riding their horses or any of the details of everyday life because people could not read or write. And if they could read or write, they didn't have any paper. And if they had paper, they didn't have any books. There was almost nothing to read in Los Angeles during that period, except for governmental records. Governmental records continued. The Spanish Provincial Archives contains a lot of information, or once did, about this period. The Spanish Provincial Archives burned in the fire of 1906. I understand that in Sacramento, they have a state archives which has some rancho records, has a lot of rancho records. But the records of everyday life, you know, how much wheat was grazed, how many cattle there were, who was allocated property, a lot of that, no, almost all of that was lost in 1906. One of the things that saved this history was H.H. Bancroft, who wrote his history, several volumes of California. And volume 1 discusses the Spanish period, volume 2 goes into the Mexican era. The Spanish period is usually assumed to be 1769, when the Gaspar de Portola expedition was the first land expedition in California. The Spanish had been off the coast. They had even sailed close to San Francisco Bay, but they couldn't see into it. But they didn't explore the land or try to occupy the land until 1769. In 1821, there was a successful Mexican Revolution. I'm not up to speed on all the Mexican revolutions, but it sounds like everybody was having a revolution every few months in Mexico and every few years in California. There were a number of Americans and people from other countries that came fairly early on. In 1826, the French traveler Auguste Duhaut-Silly came to Los Angeles and stood on a hill and described what he saw. Don Benito Wilson came pretty early on. Joseph Chapman, the famous pirate who built most of the church downtown, he arrived in about 1821, 1822 from Santa Barbara. He'd been captured up in Santa Barbara, and they found him the most useful man in Los Angeles. So he came down about 1822, settled, and left. So there were different influences early in the Mexican era that were other than the Spanish influences. This picture, when Mark sent it to me, I didn't believe it was the Avila Adobe, because it's the back of the Avila Adobe. And it's the back of the Avila Adobe, certainly before the 1872 restoration, 1972, 1973 restoration. But it's also before the 1933 earthquake. Some of the building was damaged in the earthquake. To me, it looks like it's about, my guess was 1928. I'd like you to look at a couple of things. This is the back porch of the way this was before it was restored. You can see a patch of brick over on one side. Brick was not used in Los Angeles until the 1850s, because there was no brick kiln. Nobody made bricks before the 1850s. And the first brick kiln was actually built by a resident of, well, probably where we are right now, whose name is escaping me, darn, he was a Mormon. And he lived right around here, and he had his brick kiln downtown Los Angeles. So this means that this picture shows a house that on the surface looks old, but has already been restored sometime in the American era because it's using bricks. Also, you can see inside the windows, there are pots. This house was still being used. And there are peppers, red chili peppers, which are almost emblematic of a Hispanic household to have the drying red chili peppers. If this was used in a movie, it's pretty scruffy. It's got things you can't even identify, like that thing on the side, and a table, a plant that isn't really growing yet. If we could have the next slide. Okay, this is 1930. This is a 1930 photograph from the Los Angeles Public Library, Tessa, which I recommend anyone who wants to dream their way through the past is to go to the Los Angeles Public Library site and get lost for hours. So, in this site, the bench that Cooper sat on is on a piece of wood that goes horizontal, and the rest of the porch goes vertical. The porch is beginning to decay, again suggesting that the other picture was taken before that. The peppers are gone. In 1928, before Christine Sterling advocated for the recreation of the whole idea of the Avila Adobe, Fred Rampal, a grandchild of Encarnacion Sepulveda and Francisco Avila, was interviewed in the Los Angeles Times. He said that they lived in this house until he was three, and then they moved to the rancho. And he said he thought the house was built in the 1830s. But that that's also going to be wrong. The house was not built in the 1830s. Backing up a little, the name Encarnacion Sepulveda, she was the daughter of Francisco Sepulveda. Her name and other Spanish women's names have gotten lost. They mostly got lost because Spanish-speaking people here, the women could keep, and as far as I figure out, always did keep their maiden names. When the Americans came in and started making maps, they either changed the name to a male name, or they changed it to the husband's name, and they changed the property from the wife's name into the husband's name, because the Americans assumed, unlike the Spanish-speaking people, that only men were competent to own property. Women in Los Angeles did not vote until I think it was 1911. It didn't matter who they were. The Spanish women didn't vote, and the Mexican era women did not vote either. But the women had a greater role in participation and, in many ways, greater equality than the women that came from the Victorian era in the United States. Another thing is that even though California adopted Spain's, Mexico's community property laws, most people did not understand them at all. So they did not understand that a woman could have her separate property, which she inherited. A hypothesis or guess that I have is that that land that she settled on, that plateau of land that used to extend from Fort Moore Hill no longer exists, the entire hill is gone. But that apron of land, I think, was occupied by people related to the first settlers that came to Los Angeles. The first settlers in Los Angeles were not just the pobladores, the people that came up from Mexico. They were also the soldiers and the soldiers' families. So when we look at where Los Angeles began in 1781, you have to take into consideration the soldiers' families were also here. And my guess, my hypothesis, is that 3 families were here before 1781, living in this general area. One of them, Vicente Feliz, who I believe also lived right about where we are right now. That was part of the lecture on the Los Feliz Rancho and the road to get here from Los Angeles. If anyone's interested, they can contact me and I'll tell them the road. Okay, Ronald, the next slide. This shows that it declined. The land declined in the back. There is now this tribute to Christine Sterling, this building that they made in 1973 in the back of the courtyard. But the land went down. And if you look closely at a map on the Huntington website, which I'm going to get to, you can see that this whole area called El Pueblo de Los Angeles Historical Monument, it was built on a bluff, an elevation. The bluff continued through Chinatown, and where North Broadway, when you go down North Broadway across the Broadway Bridge, you can see the elevation of land above the flat land. So this area was obviously geographically an important area because it was elevated above the floodplain. You can't see that anymore. And somehow, I don't know how, Olvera Street, what is now called Olvera Street, goes all the way to West Cesar Estrada Chavez Avenue. And I don't know how that happened because in one old drawing, you can see that that was all elevated land. Okay, next slide. This is the front of Olvera Street in 1932. For some reason, they have a Mexican flag. I think that's a Mexican flag. Can anyone tell me if that is? What it is? And this is going to be the famous street, Olvera Street. Before it was Olvera Street, the Americans called it Wine Street, and the Spanish called it Calle de la Viña. Well, Spanish and Italian. It's a hybrid word, which shows that Italians were already present in Los Angeles and influencing the way that language was interpreted. Because it wasn't like Spanglish, I don't know what you call it, it was Italian Spanish for a period of time. Calle de la Viña, you can't see it in this, but there is a big vine. Michael Holland, archivist for the Los Angeles Municipal Records, had that big vine DNA tested. And the big vine behind it had the DNA identical to the Spanish mission, the San Gabriel mission. The Padres created a hybrid grape, and the hybrid grape was the native grapes and combined with European grapes. So it was unique. And that grew out of the back of the Avila Adobe, showing the Avila Adobe was probably pretty early built, is the presence of that vine, which I've seen some pictures, it canopies the whole street. I haven't looked for it really. I just met pictures. Okay, next photograph. Okay, the fantasy past. It's not just in films, it's in books. It's everywhere, the fantasy past of Los Angeles. And one of the chief ingredients of that was a travel writer's work, Helen Hunt Jackson. Her writing is available online about Los Angeles, and I recommend it. It's very interesting. She was fairly condescending in her writing. She made people seem exotic, colorful, and she made a fortune at doing that. But her primary interest in coming to Los Angeles had not been to add to her fortune. It was to publicize what was happening to the Southern California Indians. So she came here to write about it. She got a lot of detail that she put into her book, Ramona. And she had hoped it would lead to outrage at the condition of how Indians were treated. She had written first a century of dishonor about all of the broken treaties with the Indians. Nobody was really interested. She got herself to be employed by the Department of the Interior and came through here visiting missions and talking with people. And the Senate actually approved what she had been writing, but again, it went nowhere. The condition of the Indians was never improved. In her writing, she did not realize that she was also a person of her time, as we are people of our time, and she had her particular biases and her way of looking at the world. That was one ingredient of the fantasy past. Around Christine Sterling is the lady who advocated the establishment of the fake Mexican marketplace called Olvera Street. Olvera is named after Augustine Olvera, who was the first Los Angeles County Superior Court judge. And that street was named Olvera in 1876. And she wrote about that time, money, of which there was plenty, was just for necessities. I can stop right there. Of course money is for necessities. The men owned and rode magnificent horses. True. The women were flower-like and silken laces. No. There were picnics in the hills, dancing at night, moonlight serenades. Well, since nobody wrote about it, we don't know. Maybe there were picnics in the hills and dancing at night and moonlight serenades. But since people weren't reading and writing, they weren't writing about any of these, so I don't know how she would know about any of these. That's part of the fantasy past, Ronald. Why she would claim she was the only source of history information that the Avila Adobe was built in 1818 by a wealthy ranchero, Francisco Avila. Nobody before her had said that. She made it up. Is it possible the house was built in 1818? It is possible. Is it likely? It's not. But there were two reasons, more than two reasons, for this myth that she created that the house was built in 1818 by a wealthy ranchero. And part of it was to dispel the bigotry against Mexican people and to turn it into a colorful, fake world that was, in one writer's world, a safe and sanitized mythic past that obscured the contemporary reality of Mexicans living in Los Angeles. This house may have been Encarnacion Sepulveda's separate property. Even in writing about the Rampo family, when I come across it, Mary, you didn't come in. Rampo Boulevard goes to the middle of Los Angeles, and it was part of Rancho Las Ciénegas. They refer to the Rampo children as descendants of Francisco Avila. They completely left out, in everything I've read, that these children had a grandmother as well as a grandfather. Because in the American view, the men are the dominant everything. At this time, when she's advocating for preservation of the Adobe, there was bubonic plague in Los Angeles. And most of it was centered very close to Olvera Street, across what was then Macy Street. And Macy Street is now a portion of what used to be Sunset Boulevard and is now West Cesar Estrada Chavez Avenue. So the street that it was, the epicenter of it was on Santa Clara Street, which is gone. That whole area is gone. And I read the Twin Towers jail complexes on top of that area. But I don't think that's correct. So there was a lot of bias, especially as churned out by the Los Angeles Times, against Mexican people. Because they called it the Mexican plague. Because some of the people who got it were Mexican, and this Macy Street district was occupied partly by Mexican people and other ethnic working class people. The idea behind that was that the real estate developers in the Los Angeles Times, which owned a lot of that land around there, wanted to make it clear that people coming to live here who were white people were not going to get bubonic plague. this time, it was the beginning of the Great Depression. And the United States, California, Los Angeles repatriated people with roots in Mexico. Perhaps up to 50,000 people were removed from Mexico, some of them, from Los Angeles. And some of them were American citizens. And they were repatriated back in Mexico, put on trains, asked to leave, please go. And they left because the non-Mexican people were saying the Mexican people were taking their jobs, which is certainly denying the reality of all of the causes of the Great Depression. So her myth that it was, the house was built in the Spanish era, which was 1818. The Spanish era ended in 1821, but nobody in Los Angeles heard about it until 1822. So the Spanish era can be said to last from 1769 to 1821. From 1821 or 1822 until 1846 is considered the Mexican era, when the Mexican government ruled California. Should I continue? Are there questions already? Okay. Next slide. This is the cross on Olvera Street in about 1930. There's a new cross there. This suggests that this was Spanish and this was Catholic. How it is that this isn't a violation of the First Amendment, separation of church and state, I don't understand. But this cross was placed here to show Catholicism and Spain. That was part of the build-up that they created. The original Olvera Street did not have a cross line. Next slide. In the movies, we have this image of a period of, very attractive caballeros, dark-eyed, dark-haired senoritas wearing nice clothing, and it's a very romantic image that we have from the whole Zorro series, which I grew up with too, on television with the Zorro series. Yes?
I was an extra in one of the Zorro episodes.
What did you play?
Or did
you play anybody?
The Pueblo, of course, was a Disney studio. And it was what you said, everything is so clean and nice and wonderful. The rancho period was the vaqueros. It was rough and tumble. There's hardly any silk dresses I would ever seen. So it is a romanticized version of old California, absolutely.
What was your day rate?
What?
What was your day rate?
I don't remember. I was about 10, I think, or 11.
Ron, next.
It wasn't much.
Okay, the truth, if you take off the fantasy past about the Spanish period, I don't write this here, but Alta California was called the Spanish borderlands. It was on the outskirts of the New World, and at this time, when they decided to colonize California, Spain didn't have the resources to do very much. So it's called a neglected province. To me, that is a very interesting thing to look at, because it was a social experiment with the people that came here, and they had virtually no government, and they kind of worked around that fact. As it says here, the Spanish citizens did not provide livelihoods for themselves beyond bare subsistence. They had to import goods. They had no money. They made no money. The only country they were allowed to trade with was Spain, and Spain was sending fewer and fewer ships. 1810 and 1821, there was only one ship. So it was impossible for Francisco Avila to be a wealthy ranchero during the Spanish era. There were 4 or 5 ranchos here during the Spanish era, but there's nothing to indicate that anybody was wealthy at that time. I spoke at the beginning about vertigo, which has these references to the gold rush, Carlotta Valdez. One of the other fantasies that we have is the Americans came and took all of the Spanish land and Mexican land, and that all kinds of abuses happened to the Spanish-speaking people here. In fact, the people living here did not become wealthy until the gold rush in Northern California. These were the cow counties. They had no money. They exchanged cattle hides, which was probably not very convenient to carry around a cattle hide with you. So, with the gold rush, the Argonauts, the gold seekers in Northern California, were very hungry. They demanded beef, and where did they get the beef? From the cow counties. So the people in the cow counties who owned land, who owned ranchos, drove them through, I'm sure, drove them through Rancho Los Feliz into the valley, into Northern California, and became very wealthy. The effects of the American occupation were both negative and positive for the people that were already living here. Okay, next slide.
Could you hold the microphone 5 inches? Yeah, but because of there's some interference when it goes too close.
This is called a Costa picture, which is sort of showing the different races of people. This one is in Puebla, and it's a woman who represents one ethnic category, and her husband another, and her child another. I put it up for 2 reasons. One is to show the incredible ethnic diversity of people that came to Los Angeles. The other, this is not Los Angeles, but the people came up from Mexico, and they came up from Chile, but not the original pobladores. I also put it up because there is no information on what people were wearing. Christine Sterling said silks and laces and, probably a fan and tia. We don't know. I've Googled this and I've looked online for maybe a couple of hours. There's nothing on what they were. This is suggestive of what, because it's from the same period in Puebla, Mexico, of what a man and woman may have been wearing. Next slide. This is from Lima, and it shows an affluent family, one black and one white, and their child, the child is called a mulatto. This is another Costa painting to show what happens with marriages of people of different ethnicities and what their names are. The names are too complicated for me to remember, but this one I can remember. A Spanish and an African creates mulatto child. This also might have been clothing because it's the same period. It's the 18th century. So it's not at all like the image you get in Hollywood. But this was an affluent couple. Again, I don't know what they might have been wearing. Next. This is plausibility of what people might have been wearing. These are Indians. This was shot in approximately 1890, and the Seaver Center has made me sign this huge agreement for the right to use this. This is from the Natural History Museum, which also has some very wonderful photographs of the time. So, given that the people, the Indian people, frequently wore the discarded clothing of the Spanish and Mexican people, this may have been the way that people were looking in Los Angeles during the Spanish era, before people started to get some money. Okay, next slide. I've already talked about women kept their maiden names. And American era writers did not understand community property. The land was held in usufruct, which means no one could buy or sell it. You just lived on it, and you could will it to your sons and daughters. But it didn't go to your wife. However, that's just separate property. If it was allocated to the male got it. Rancho Las Ciénegas was a gift, separate property, to Francisco Avila in 1823. And you can tell that's how they treated it, because all of his descendants, the children from the first marriage, well, not one of them, the children from the first marriage and the children from the second marriage all inherited Rancho Las Ciénegas. The one that did not inherit was a woman. She died before Encarnacion Sepulveda. This woman was the daughter from the first marriage of Francisco Avila. She died beforehand, but I'd like to point out that she was not married and had 10 children. And the father of 5 of them, the fathers of 5 of them were unknown, which suggests this woman sort of disappeared from the Avila and Verdugo families. Her mother, the first wife of Francisco, was a Verdugo. And not exactly the Verdugo from Glassell Park, Rancho Verdugo, but from the brother of the guy who owned that rancho. And I've already discussed cattle were California's banknotes. They could buy and sell land after the Spanish went away and the Mexican government governed California. But until the Americans started coming with their Yankee ideas of enterprise, nobody really wanted to buy anything here. So cattle, again, remained the largest source of income. So the cattle multiplied on their own, unless bears ate them or cougars ate them. And cattle multiplied on their own. Horses were stampeding all over the San Gabriel Valley. They were not that valuable as were the California banknotes. Things got better under Mexico financially because they could trade with other countries. So things immediately started to get better and they could have more goods. These are going to affect the Avila Adobe. It is very unlikely that a house like Christine Sterling described, a house on which the ranchero spared no money, and he didn't have any, so that is impossible. That he imported French doors from Spain that came around the Horn on a ship, also impossible. it was not just severely damaged, it was entirely rebuilt. And I'm sorry that they rebuilt it, because there was some great archaeological work that could have been done. Some was done, and we're going to talk about that, and that was pretty good, but there are problems with it. All right, next slide. This is permission for Encarnacion Sepulveda and Francisco Avila to get married in 1822. His first wife, Verdugo, died in July 1822, and he married the 15-year-old Encarnacion a couple of months later. He already had 3 children at that time, the one who may have been living on Avila, and the other 2 who eventually had children very influential in Los Angeles. So it was impossible for him to have built the house for his bride, Encarnacion Sepulveda, in 1818, when they didn't get married till 1822, and he owned no land till 1823. Okay, next slide. This one is a chromolithograph of Los Angeles from some point on the hill that no longer exists, Fort Moore Hill, looking down at the town. You can make out the church and some buildings around the church. And in the distance is a big house. The big house in the distance is Casa de Lugo, Vicente Lugo's house. You cannot make out the Avila Adobe in this one. So you can see the plaza area there. It wasn't what we think of as a plaza. It was a big dirt area. And it kind of blended in to the road. And there's another kind of a road in the background. Is this better? Oh. So this doesn't look like what we usually think of as the plaza area, the center of social life, people dancing around and stuff like that. It was still, this is an 1853 drawing from an American, Charles Opal. Nothing happened. Oh, there's a pointer. I see. I thought you were telling me I could change this. This is the plaza. Okay, Ronald?
Will we do?
No.
Oh, next slide.
This is the EOC Ord. This is a detail from the EOC Ord Plan de la Ciudad de Los Angeles. The original 1849 survey of Los Angeles by William Rich Hutton and EOC Ord is lost. Like almost everything, these things keep getting lost. But in the 1870s, people from the department or the Bureau of Engineering took pieces of paper, put them together that they found, and created a Plan de la Ciudad de Los Angeles. This street is Calle de Eternidad. Is going to become extended past the Catholic Cemetery here out to the Broadway Bridge. But there was no way to get to the Broadway Bridge at this time, which is 1849. Colegio, there was Colegio Street called College Street, still today in Chinatown. You've probably all seen College Street. There was no college. But Colegio means school. The Americans assumed it meant college. So this has become College Street. This is Eternidad. This is Main Street. This is the church. The whole thing is tilted. This is north-south, that line. And this is Main Street, which kind of goes like that. It's kind of become Spring Street. It's very confusing if you go to that area. Main Street, Spring Street, what street are you on? The Avila Adobe is this. And you can see a little protrusion right here, which we'll see better later. This was the Zandra Madre. The Zandra Madre was extended sometime after 1786 and before 1840. And this is some of the agricultural land. This is the cornfield. They keep telling you at Los Angeles State Historic Park, they tell you there was no cornfield. There was a cornfield. And that's why they call it a cornfield. And I guess those people keep saying, not a cornfield. They didn't look, there was a cornfield. He drew in a few houses. As you can see, Los Angeles was not particularly well established at that time. This was the area, I'm not sure which one anymore, where Francisco Avila lived. His house was up here, and his farmland, well, not his farmland, but the land he farmed was down in this area. Okay, next. You might be able to see that this drawing shows the Avila house with an attached house. In the 1849 picture, in the 1849 plan, they just did a little bump. This is like a different wing. The architect, the house downtown doesn't have this little wing. This wing somehow got bigger and ended the bluff, and then a street was about 1873, somewhere around 1873, they turned this into a street. Encarnacion's brother lived in this house here. And her father lived across on the other side, probably until he was granted a rancho. As you can see, the front of the church is just sort of a false front. This was to come down in the 1861-1862 mega flood. This is the Padre's house, sometimes called the church rectory. Before it was the Padre's house, it was called the Comisionado's house. And I don't know if it was called anything before then, because I haven't been able to track how old this is, this structure here. This structure was replaced with a different Padre's house in the 1860s. You can see, again, there is nothing that you would consider a plaza, like we're talking about it today. Christine Sterling said it was the finest house on the plaza. There were no fine houses on the plaza in 1847. And it's hard to tell where the plaza was in 1847. Okay. This is again William Rich Hutton. This is from the Huntington Library in San Marino. You could just go on that website and look up each of these pictures and see what was going on. Where the red thing is, that was the plaza. When William Rich Hutton drew this picture. This area you could just make out. You could just make out the church, just barely. But if you go to the website, you could blow it up and you can see it. This was Fort Moore Hill, Big Hill, Big Hill. It was first excavated for dirt in the 1930s, and the dirt was used to create a level track bed for Union Station. And entirely, almost entirely disappeared with the Los Angeles 101 freeway. The rest of the dirt was excavated. If you stand on Sunset, Sunset did not go through until at least 1904. But if you stand on Sunset today and wait for the bus, you can see there's a rise in the land. And that's all that's left of this big hill. So, next slide, next slide. I tried to pull it up, this did not come up well. But the Avila Adobe would have been over here. And again, this is the big plaza area at this time. This is going to be Alameda Street, right here. And as far as figuring out where Main Street was, I guess Main Street was partly the plaza and partly went through here. My best guess. Okay, next slide. Hutton did this other picture. And this one is called Part of Town and Vineyard. I think the house he was living in was the prior house over here. And he would sometimes come out to sketch various areas, and he climbed up to Fort Moore Hill and would get a different perspective. This is Casa de Lugo, which is going to become part of Old Chinatown. This is the Avila Adobe, and why it changed, I don't know. That little house is still here, but it turns out this house, which in another picture looks like a separate house, was another wing of the Avila Adobe. None of those are discussed in the pictures of the core building here. You can see there was a wall at one time, so they had a courtyard in the back that was protected by a wall that's gone. Questions? Okay, next. This is 1856 survey of part of Los Angeles. And you can see that the Santa Madre went along the bottom of the bluff. The bluff is still there. It's still higher there. The church cemetery is still here, but the bodies are going to be relocated. This is the Willard property by that time, and this is a road that's called Toma Street that went up to the dam, or Toma. This was what was left of the original Pobladores farmland, was in this area, and by the time of this, it's being relocated. Francisco Avila was living somewhere around here, farming on the old Pueblo Suertes, sometimes called the Pueblo land. And this is in a census, the 1816 census. The 1816 census, there's a copy at the Autry Research Center, but I don't recommend it. It's really tiny, tiny writing. You can't see it. But it's mentioned in H.H. Bancroft's History of California, and he lists all the people living in Los Angeles at that time. So this is where Francisco Avila, purportedly the builder of the Avila Adobe in 1818, was living, was over in this area, over here. Okay, next. This, as far as I can figure out, is what the site of his house looks like. I could be wrong, But this is the, about the area where his house was supposed to have been. Next slide. We have some diagrams that you have. Okay. In 1971, 1972, the Avila Adobe was severely damaged, and Long Beach, a professor of anthropology, came with undergraduate and graduate students and did a report on what the house looked like. And this is their estimate. One of the problems with this was that El Pueblo de Los Angeles Historical Monument insisted the date was 1818 for the house. So the house is, the research was done predicated on the idea that it was 1818. Another flaw that I saw with it was they went for the ages of the house based on the layers of whitewashing, partly on the layers of whitewashing that, on the house. So they came up with these dates, and they start off with circa 1818, but they were given that date. And then they say there were 2 rooms, and this was the kitchen because there was a fireplace. My guess, my story, is that this was the original house, 1 room. Then they calculated from 1825 to 1830 that the house was added to, and then the house was added to again here. But they're missing the 2 wings. There's no story that was told about the 2 wings, and they weren't even taken into consideration because they no longer existed at the time the study was done. Okay, next slide. This is another larger picture of, they took the unrestored house. Gary Cooper was sitting back here, somewhere back here. And it looks like that room was a kitchen. Over here they have a clay working pit they discovered and a trash pit. In the trash pit they found some Indian artifacts. They found all kinds of stuff in this house. It was like a museum in the floorboards and so forth. The earth was hard packed, and then in the 19th century they made a wood floor by putting wood joists on top of the dirt and then laying planks across. As a result, there were lots of holes and cracks and everything. They didn't have vacuum cleaners. Everything went through the floor underneath it. A tremendous amount of trash appeared under the floorboards, even just walking around in other rooms. So this was the richest area right here. It was the trash pit where they found trash from Indian, Spanish, and Mexican and American times. All there. The rest of the rooms don't really interest me because it's very hard to figure out. They put in doors, they put in walls, they moved in things, and they decided that the dates of building were what they said in the previous one, and there's, you may have in your hand copies of these diagrams.
Bill?
Yes?
I see that a modern brick as opposed to older brick.
Well, the houses were all Adobe.
Yeah.
Adobe is sun-baked, and brick is kiln built. So that was the difference, and they didn't address what the brick was doing. Maybe they changed it since then. Okay, next slide. In 1818, Governor Sola came here, and he said, concerning San Jose and Los Angeles, house construction is for the most part of palisada, wooden poles, and a very few of adobe roofed with straw without regard for precise measurement in their positions. The houses were still in 1818 sort of just all over Los Angeles. Pretty much, you know, not different from today. There is no luxurious house with French doors in 1818. Okay, next slide. So Joseph Chapman, the shipbuilder, blacksmith, carpenter, pirate that arrived in Los Angeles, possibly in shackles, he was the one who at least completed the church downtown, commonly called La Placita. They established a vineyard in 1824, and I believe, my guess is, that the adobe that they occupied and that he restored was the original 1814 church in Los Angeles, and that it became the Vineyas property, and I'm sure you've all been or seen Vinya Street. It was generally in that area. The 101 cuts through it, so it's hard to describe. And Christine Sterling had written that Francisco Avila spared no expense to describe a period when there was no money and almost no workers. Many of the skilled tradesmen were at the missions. The Indian skilled artisans were at the missions. There's going to be another big change, and that's 1834, when the missions are secularized and the Indians are emancipated. And then suddenly in 1834, Los Angeles has skilled workers that came from the missions. Not only that, but there was a colony that came up from Mexico in 1834, and they got their first school teachers. I mean, they had people that sort of taught for a while, but they had their first people who saw themselves as professional school teachers in 1834, and they also had people that were construction workers and identified themselves as carpenters. So the likely time that work would have been done on the Avila Derby is 1834, or after 1834. It would have been turned into a bigger house after 1834. Francisco Avila died in 1832. So who was doing this work? The only person who could have been doing it was Encarnacion Sepulveda, who was living in the house in 1847 when the house was called Casa de las Sepulvedas. It was, the Spanish didn't call it the Avila house. They saw it as the house of female people with the name Sepulveda. Okay, next one. Okay. Paul, do you want to read this? Jedediah Smith's party completed the first recorded journey to Southern California by land from the United States. He wrote, he put up with his friend F. Avila. And Paul, what did he say?
The HO village in which my friend resided contained 70 or 80 houses. The walls of mud and unburnt brick, and the roofs of thatch or tile. They were general small.
This is 1826, which again is suggesting there was no great mansion or house built in 1818. Next slide. Miguel Blanco was born Michael White. Michael White married into the family of one of the oldest women in Los Angeles, Eulalia Perez, married one of her daughters, and they lived in what was called San Gabriel at that time, but is now called San Marino. Eulalia had been granted Pasadena, Rancho San Pascal, but it was eventually taken from her. And Emily Hayes came in 1853, and she visited her, and she said, Mrs. White's house has chickens and dogs living in it, along with the people. So that is a suggestion of what houses may have been like, because she came in 1852. Next slide. This is the picture that is purportedly Encarnacion's Olvera. After working on Spanish colonial history for years, I tend not to believe anything I read. But it's also the picture that is in front of the Avila Adobe downtown on Olvera Street. So this is maybe what she looked like, but by this time she's in middle age. She married when she was 15. She had three children. One of them died when she was a small child. Next slide. This is one of her grandchildren, one of the Rampal grandchildren. Encarnacion's daughter married Theodore Rampal. They had 19 children. And eventually they sold off their land for real estate development, were quite wealthy, and they moved to Anaheim. There were no photographs of many of the people that I'm talking about because there were no cameras. And people didn't have the money to hire painters in most cases. But so I'm putting these up to give a suggestion of what this young woman looks Hispanic to me. She doesn't look German to me, but so I think this is a suggestion of what she may have, they may have looked like. Next slide. This is one of my favorites. This is Fred Rampal of the Anaheim Police Department. And he's the one who was interviewed in 1928 and talked about when the villa, he thought the Villa Adobe house was built. Next slide. The El Pueblo de Los Angeles Historical Monuments staff based their conclusion the house was built in 1818 because a man named A.G. Ruxpin constructed this map. And I don't know who he was, but a few years later, he was a surveyor in Virginia. So he didn't do particularly well here. But he drew in a couple of mistakes. One of them is he said this house was the John Hayes house. John Hayes was the son of Benjamin Hayes and his wife Emily. So they lived over here, and this was probably a house about 50 years old at the time, and it was a one-room house. The Pico house, you've seen it downtown, it's here. Mary, that's the house we went to, and there in the exhibit. And this was built on Antonio Coronel's property, and this is again Sepulveda property over here. And some of these names over here are people who married into the Sepulveda family. The Americans called it Wine Street, and they call this Marshall Street after, I guess it was on the city council, and he committed suicide, so they named the street after him. And you can see Olvera Street didn't quite, at the time this didn't quite reach Macy Street, later Sunset. It was just over here. And Ruxton decided that the house belonged to the Garfias family and the Rampal family. No, it was inherited by the the daughters of Encarnacion Sepulveda. And he also decided that this was the Francisco Avila house. And he put the date 1812. So the researcher for the historical monument said, well, this map shows that the Ayuntamiento granted the house to Francisco in 1812, when the census of 1816 shows that he owed nothing in 1816. But Ruxton knew better and he put that in. However, next slide. His supervisor, whose name I can't pronounce, his supervisor rewrote his Ruxton's survey. He put in the correct names and he took out the date 1812. Nonetheless, to this day, El Pueblo de Los Angeles Historical Monument relies on the uncorrected survey, and they won't budge. Next. Okay. This is Emily Hayes, and because this is taking a long time, I'll just read it. I showed you where her house was. It is a mud house with a mud floor. The walls are whitewashed, but the ceiling looks like an old smokehouse and leaks finely when it rains. There is a little fireplace in one corner where I do my cooking. We have no andirons. The dirt floor we have is covered with matting. In a long, narrow box nailed to the wall, we keep our dishes, which are half a dozen plates, knives, forks, 2 or 3 tin cups. On one side of the room, we have a washstand on which I am now writing, and where I keep the few books I have. And over this hangs the Madonna, which the priest gave Mr. Hayes for me. And this is 1852. So the Sepulveda house, or the Avila Adobe, was obviously much better than that by 1847. But the beginning of that house, the first room of that house was probably like this. And they probably kept the dog and the cats and the chickens and who knows what else inside of their house as well. I never found out where anyone went to the bathroom. It's not on anything. Okay, next slide. The fantasy continued that Christine Sterling saved the Adobe from demolition. This is hard to read. Remember I talked to you at the beginning about the plague that started across Macy Street in the Macy Street district, bubonic plague. This sign does not say it's going to be demolished. It says the house has to be vacated. It is unfit for human habitation by reason of, and you can't, I can't, maybe, Ronald says maybe some AI can figure out what that says, but I can read this, and unsanitary conditions. This is not at all surprising during a time when there's bubonic plague, that they would say the tenants have to move out. And you can go right up to it if you want, Mark. You can see what it says. I can't. And I tried to find ordinance 30.619. Maybe I can find it someday. So remember those floorboards? They had a dirt floor on hard pack. That was the original dirt floor. They put joists and then they laid wood across to make a wood floor. And all of that stuff is going into the space between the wood floor and the dirt floor, and it's rat heaven. So it would have been very easy to have an unsanitary Avila Adobe. The archaeologists or anthropologists found many poisoned dead rats and mice.
I was just about to add to that. I'm working with Rancho Camulos, which is, where the Ramona story was started and all. And they are having a problem now with rats and other rodents burrowing into the adobe walls. All they have to do is just dig in there. So this must have been going on 150 years ago, where you have rodents living under the house. Can you imagine that? Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, rat heaven. Brad saved through a metal pipe on Ronald's dishwasher once. Rats can get it everywhere. So this does not say the house has to be demolished. This says the house has to be cleaned up. As far as I can tell, unless somebody can decipher it, they probably had to fill up the adobe walls. They probably had to do something with the floors as well. So the story that Christine Sterling, socialite Christine Sterling, who's finished with two marriages and is making up stuff about the Avila Adobe, saved it from the bulldozers is not correct. The house would have eventually been bulldozed, of course it would have been. But that property was owned by Harrison Otis, Ray Harrison Otis, the head of the editor and owner of the Los Angeles Times. And he was the biggest proponent of Sterling's plan. And he owned real estate in the area. There is a wonderful book by Phoebe Kropp called California Vieja, which I did not read because I thought it was a stupid title at first. But then I read about it, and this is one of the things that she talks about, is that it was to gentrify the area. It was on purpose. It wasn't for romance and dancing in moonlight or things like that. The romance and the dancing in moonlight was PR to save the Adobe. I mean, I'm glad it's there because it's really interesting. Okay, next. This was this was Olvera Street. Before, these buildings I think are still there. The Villa Adobe was there. You can see City Hall, new at this time, 1928, looming up there. The same problem with water, as you can tell, they still have, but it was unpaved in 1928. Okay, next slide. This is the Avila Adobe on the other side of the street. But I put it too because it was either it's a bad photograph or there's no City Hall. There should be City Hall right about here. Or maybe it was really foggy. And this was the plaza here. The other houses that existed at one time are gone. And you can see it goes down. The water's running down. So the street that we see today looks a lot different. Okay, next. That's the last one. Okay.
They consider this whole thing an alley, actually. That they always refer to it as an alleyway, Olvera Street.
Oh, they do. Okay, and in 1847, the Ayuntamiento referred to it, before it was Calle de la Viña, referred to it as the passage to Mrs. Sepulveda's house.
Passage.
Yes.
What was Sterling's motivation for propagating this?
Well, there's a slide on that one and what I figure it was, because I can only guess. One is I think she was a well-intentioned, very romantic person who was immersed in Ramona and other kinds of things. I think she was genuine. She was called an effective historian. She didn't know history. They have a historical monument there. I contacted the state and I got their file on the Avila Adobe, and nothing describes a date of 1818 or Francisco Avila. There were, however, some WPA writings, and those writings were so bad they assumed that Francisco Avila was his brother, Jose Maria Avila, or one of his brothers, Jose Maria Avila. It was extremely bad history, which the state of California and El Pueblo Los Angeles Historical Monument keeps on going. But the date 1818 makes this family Spanish. Spanish means white. Spanish does not mean Mexican. So it's sanitized, the myth sanitized this and made it safe. Yeah, they became white. By the way, in Mexico, you could buy, if you weren't white and you got rich, you could buy a paper that said that you were white. So,